My guest today is Ben Dullroy. He's bringing the perspective of an end user and leader inside defence, which is exactly what makes today's conversation so valuable. For founders building defence and dual-use technologies, there's no one better to help us understand what really matters when you're pitching to the army. Welcome to the briefing room. Whether you're in defence, investing into the future, or simply curious about how great ideas become reality, this is your mission briefing. Let's get started. Ben, welcome to Beaten Zone Ventures podcast, the briefing room. And of course, we've got Jake Bostock here joining me today to drum you with some questions and learn a little bit more about yourself. But first of all, can you introduce yourself and what it is that you do now, today?
Yeah, sure. So Ben Dullroy, I do a couple of different things. So for my main focus, I run a small little company, Bravo Delta, which focuses on consulting to defence and national security. I also have the privilege of being an advisor to Beaten Zone Venture Partners, which is great, and particularly helping out on content and any advice I can provide. And I also have a alter ego, so to speak. I'm in the Army Reserves still, and whilst today I'm speaking in my private capacity, I'm a Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Reserves and spend 100 plus days a year in uniform, still thinking about the warfighter and training the warfighter and doing what we can to serve this nation.
So usually the transition from full-time service and then heading out into the corporate landscape or starting your own venture requires a bit of planning or thought about it. Did you have a transition plan? Or did you follow anything, or was it just a decision you needed to change? Yeah,
for me, I joined the Army. I went through the Australian Defence Force Academy and Royal Military College Duntroon with a focus on it being a foundation to my career, not my long-term career. So it's still funny that I'm in the Army Reserves all this time later. But I did about 10 years in the full-time Army and then made a decision to start planning to transition. And the big goal for me was to deploy on an operation and serve my nation. I did that in Iraq in 2006. And so when I came back, I started thinking about what's next. My wife and I had only been recently married. We're thinking about having a family and wanting to settle down. And so I went back to university and studied a Master's in Business Administration. And Defence has got some great programs there where they'll provide you a part scholarship. So I took up that opportunity. And that MBA really opened my eyes to a few different areas in industry I wasn't really thinking about. And so that gave me a good opportunity to think about what I wanted to do next and a couple of areas to target in that job search process.
Do you think that's key, is having fellow ex-defence personnel in the environment that you're going into to help with the transition?
Yeah, it certainly helps. There's two key people that play a real role in that transition success. One is the ex-defence and veterans community. So yeah, it is really important to have people that are conscious about reaching back and paying it forwards to people that are getting out if they've made a successful transition themselves. But the second part of it is really important as well, and that's civilian supporters. So we're just as dependent on people that are open to giving veterans a go, but also giving veterans advice and guidance, mentoring. And I think if you've got a bit of both in your team, that's how you make a really successful transition.
How old were you when you made that transition?
Yeah, I was 28.
So super young still, really. Like basically, at the beginning, most people tend to finish study, work a little bit, and then go into some sort of leadership role, maybe, if they're lucky, right? So you were super young still.
Yes.
I was the same age, actually. Transition from full-time to part-time.
And there is a lot, I think from the outside of defence, you hear about the difficulty of transition going from institutionalised into either corporate landscape. But I think from the flip side, there's so much benefit from having a veteran because there is so much that you already know and that a culture that's embedded into you early that people in the commercial world really like and we think is advantageous within teams that maybe you don't appreciate until you leave. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think there's some interesting characteristics we come, no matter which path you come in defence, which service. You certainly have immediately a service ethos and a bias to action, which I think in any occupation is really, really useful. And in general, there's also a comfort with complexity and a degree of resilience that is very hard to train or create otherwise. So certainly some really good characteristics to build from as a foundation. There's certainly some gaps that we need to remediate once you jump into the commercial world. And the big one that I found, actually really valued my MBA for this, was building that commercial and financial acumen. Because one of the things in defence is we manage resources, not money.
Yes.
So even, as a commanding officer, I have a quite small cash budget because a lot of my cash is given to me in resources. So number of people, petrol, rations, that type of thing is given to you. So you don't have that same experience of managing your P&L and having an understanding of the way things work from an annual budgeting perspective, your quarterly, finance cycles and things like that. And so that takes a little bit of getting used to. So it's definitely one of the gaps that I always encourage people making that transition is get some accounting, corporate finance training as soon as you can and bolt on those skills.
So even going back before when you first went into the army, what was the decision? Did you grow up always wanting to be involved? Did you have somebody in the family that influenced that decision? Did you attend any sort of school that might have influenced that?
Yeah, I was talking about this the other day. So I live on the Sunshine Coast. I grew up in Caloundra and we moved back there a couple of years ago. And my journey to defence started just off the beach, actually. So I'm not from a family where either my mum or dad served. I did have uncles and aunties that did. The Dullroys do have a bit of a heritage in serving, but it wasn't something that I was really aware of when I was growing up. I didn't do cadets or anything like that. For me, I was swimming with my family at Kings Beach, came off the beach, and there was a Defence Force recruiting truck that had set up there for the day.
Randomly happened to be there that day?
It did. So someone who was very good at their job at Defence Force recruiting managed to get me a brochure to Australian Defence Force Academy and Duntroon. And there was a scholarship program for ADFA at the time that was really quite appealing to someone like me. And so I went in for the scholarship originally just to take the money and run, I'll be honest. I was thinking about doing law. In the process where you go through the officer selection and the exposure you get to what ADFA is and military training is was really quite appealing. And clearly they designed it that way and they did a very good job. And so I ended up getting a scholarship and that meant that I was signing myself up for ADFA and Duntroon and about 5 years service would take me up to just under the 10-year mark. So, of course, you're entitled to long service leave at 10 years. So I stayed a couple more years extra after going to Iraq. But it was always that foundation to career, as I said. And I think one of the things when I look back now and just appreciate is just the leadership and professional development you get going through the Australian Defence Force Academy and Duntroon is just amazing. When I go down to Canberra nowadays, I try and, as regularly as possible, at least get to the gym at ADFA and just remind myself of the calibre of the cadets that we've got training there at the moment and just seeing these, really enthusiastic and engaged young Australians, just sponges for knowledge, really enthusiastic, working hard and serving the nation. And it makes me very proud, but also very optimistic about the future when I see who's coming through ADFA at the moment.
So when you joined, back in, what year was it that you ended up joining?
1999.
99. The world was looking a little bit different to what it is now, right? So if you look at any young people who are looking to join now, do you think their reason for getting involved has changed, or you think there's still an internal connection to want to serve or be aligned with a mission?
Yeah, look, I think there is a small subset, and it's always small, of young people that have a mission focus and the sort of people that if something bad occurred would not hesitate to run towards to make a difference.
Yeah.
And they're the sort of people that we will always be seeking to serve in the military and indeed as first responders in other areas. And then I think there's some additional people that probably don't see it as their natural path but have some really good characteristics to offer if they serve. And so I think what Defence has got to get better at, and it's always a challenge, is not just attracting the natural enthusiastic cohort to serve, but also those people that bring something different, might have a bit more of a creative way of thinking or a different way of thinking that we need to harness just as much.
What are we missing in terms of those gaps of different, something like you mentioned, something different to offer?
Yeah.
What could some of those things be that somebody might not be thinking about, that they might not be suited for the ADF, but those sort of skills would be useful?
I think the big one at the moment is anyone with science, technology, engineering and maths. There is a huge demand for those skill sets in defence, and particularly with AUKUS coming down range, nuclear submarines, and a lot of the high-end technology that's being brought into defence, anything from air and missile defence, some of our long-range strike, which is becoming incredibly technical and needs that STEM skill set to both support, to operate, to maintain. And so there is a huge demand for people with that skill set. So I think that is a big one that we need to focus on, because that's not necessarily the type of person that would be motivated to join and be an infantry officer and kick in doors.
No, it's almost the opposite, right?
Yeah, so it's a different type of thinking person. I think the other area that we're going to see some huge development in, as we see artificial intelligence and other systems come into service in a big way, is we're going to need that analytical mind, that data-driven person that may actually have that more from a natural skill set or a natural affinity rather than being taught. You know, I see in my own son, a lot of the times they're learning by doing, not learning by being taught at school. And often they're far ahead of the teachers in terms of where technology is at. And we need to be able to capture that informal skill set and attribute that's been developed in young Australians as well.
Yeah. What about mid-career entry?
Yeah.
And obviously I know that there is a great demand, right, for recruitment into the ADF across all levels. But what can we be doing there to sort of attract more people who might have some experience in the commercial world and then enter? Like, what's appealing to these people? How can you get that message across?
Yeah, there's certainly some programs that the Australian Defence Force is starting to work out. But what I would say in my personal capacity is I think we've got to get better at it and broaden the scope much more quickly. Cybersecurity is probably the example that springs to mind for me. Now, the best cyber operators are not in uniform.
No.
The best cyber operators who are on the tools every day and indeed dealing with some of the most complex offensive threats you can in cyber are working in places like a bank, working in places like an insurance agency right now in the commercial world. And so I think Defence has to figure out how to do a mid-career entry point for places like cybersecurity in particular to make sure that we're able to harness the best skills that are out there. And so I think some of the things we've got to deal with is how do we bring people into a hierarchical organisation but also recognise their unique skill sets. And so there's some work we probably need to do around the way that we rank and in the way that we remunerate. And the other R I'd add into this is we also need to harness the reserve component.
Yeah.
Particularly with cybersecurity.
Because that's true culturally. Like if I was to come in mid-career, I could have some amazing skills that the ADF needs. Now I have no idea about any of that, but I could learn. But how do we have the cross-pollination of those two cultures coming together?
The Americans recently brought on some really high-profile Silicon Valley tech CEO or C-level executives into, I think it was the Army Reserve, as a good, well, that's probably a higher than mid-career entry point. But that was a great example of where they were bringing the best and the brightest into uniform.
Yep. And how's that work? Is it working?
Deliberately part-time to get a different perspective, because this is the other thing is we're not necessarily going to be able to win you over to do full-time, but part-time's a different proposition to do that consulting and advice.
Project-based.
To serve your country.
100%. And with cybersecurity as an example, I don't think Defence is going to be able to pay at the rate the commercial world is. So you need to have a different way of doing this. Mid-career entry, but also using reserve models would be a really good way to attract different skill sets and harness the talent that's out there in the wider community.
Definitely. And going back, bounce around a little bit, your transition from the Australian Regular Army to reserves, what would you say was your biggest challenge and how you overcame that?
I was pretty lucky transitioning into the reserves because I'd worked in a reserve unit before, so I had a good feel what it was looking like from a general unit perspective. And then my first unit that I served in, which was then called One Field Regiment, Royal Australian Artillery, at the time was what they called an integrated unit. So it had a regular headquarters, a regular battery that I was part of, and then it had 3 reserve batteries. So I had a whole heap of peers as a lieutenant that were reservists. And so when I made that transition, some of my peers that were reservists back then were still in reserves when I transitioned as a senior captain. And so it was good to have some people that I immediately knew in the reserves and also have a degree of understanding about how the system worked. I think the biggest challenges going from regular to reserves was you don't have the same time on the tools and skill fade. There'll be time between when you pick up a key task or a key responsibility or a weapon system that you won't get the same time to train as you do in the regular. And so you have to be a lot better at getting yourself back up to speed quickly. And so even today, I still find that the context switching between what you're doing in the real world and then what you're doing in the reserves is the big challenge. But at the same time now, I'm a little bit more comfortable with it. So when I'm working in the regular army or in a defence context, I've got other things I can bring now after spending 15 years in the private sector. My financial acumen is far advanced than people of the same rank of me in the military. I can bring some context from a wider industry perspective. So often I will talk about, look, I'll take a little longer to be able to do this skill, but I'm able to give you some context that you haven't even thought about. I'm able to fill some gaps and blind spots that you don't even understand yet. And so there's some real diversity of thought that a reserves can bring to the regular force, for sure.
Yeah, definitely bridging that gap between defence, the public service enterprises out there, the defence industry. I think that's the translation in interpretation part of that's super important. And that's something that, to your point before about how we're not harnessing our reserves as much as we potentially should be, that's a skill set I think is going to be in more dire need going forward, definitely.
So with Bravo Delta Advisory, which is what you do now, is this your way of being able to take what you've learned from the private sector and the ADF and then strategise or work with your clients?
Yes.
So who are you working with in that capacity?
So at the moment, contracting back into defence, into Joint Capabilities Group. So there's some things I can say, there's some things I can't. So what I try and do is play as much of a role as I can in advising in strategy and planning. It's probably where my sweet spot is after working in defence for a few years and in the private sector. So key things that I'm really passionate about playing a role in is advising on strategy, advising on industry, and also advising on mobilisation and scaling.
Okay.
I did a Bachelor of History when I went through, a Bachelor of Arts majoring in history when I went through ADFA. My dad's a history teacher. And so one of the things I do bring to my analysis is I naturally will look at the past to see what lessons we can have for the present. And particularly in this day and age, there is so much to learn from the past. And in fact, recent history is not as useful when considering the current geopolitical circumstances that we see. So there's some of the places that I really like to play from an advisory perspective. And for the moment, I'm focusing on defence and national security, but I've worked in the commercial world, so certainly happy to jump back and help clients across the wider industry as well. After I spent 10 years working in banking and insurance after defence. So this is a pivot back to defence and national security rather than a continuation of what I had been doing previously.
And your mention there of history explains a lot of the type of content that you write, actually. You write, if anyone's read our LinkedIn posts on the Beaten Zone Ventures page, most of it's written by you, the long-form content, usually with a few links. It gives context to either what's happening currently, decisions that are being made, various political topics. But then you often do reference a historical scenario or point in time or something and then bring it back to the present point in time. So the connection to history really makes sense now to me.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think to be able to write that type of content, you've got to have deep interest as well. So the Defence Force aside, the advisory work aside, I think, are you genuinely interested in this type of content?
Yeah, particularly for me, there's been two major turning points in recent history for me. So the first was September 11. Now, I was a third-year advocate when September 11 happened. So I was sitting in my dorm room at the Australian Defence Force Academy watching on a tiny little TV what happened to the Twin Towers. And clearly that defined my regular army career from that point forwards. Within a few years, we were in Afghanistan and Iraq. I served in Iraq. And so what's probably now known as forever wars really defined my regular army career And indeed, the ripples of the Middle East area of operations are still with us now. And there's a lot of Middle East area of operations thinking in the Australian Defence Force and all Western Defence Forces now. And I think the challenge is, whilst there's lessons to be learnt from that, the type of context we're now facing is very, very, very different. And so for me, probably that second point that was a pivot point in my thinking was about the period 2016 to 2018, when I started realising that defence was starting to retrain its focus away from the Middle East area of operations. And that they were starting to really look at the horizon and see what was going on in our own region. And for me, that started my thinking a lot more about, when have we seen similar situations to this in our past? And clearly, the World War II era is the closest context we've got to the geopolitical circumstances we see now. It won't be exactly the same, but there is a lot that we can learn from that period of history and apply to the present.
So going back to your formative years in the Australian Army post-ADFA, leading 21 soldiers at the age of 21, how would you describe those formative years, and what would you say is your most important leadership lesson that you learnt?
Well, I think it is an incredible journey when you step out at 21 and take command of, in my case, it was a battery line of soldiers and senior non-commissioned officers, some of which have spent 20 plus years in defence. So it is really humbling, first off. You've got a lot of technical skill, but you don't have that same time on the tools or understanding of the job. So it does make you straight away lean into the team and getting that support from your senior non-commissioned officers in particular. But one of the things I really enjoyed about that early part of my career was also getting to know my soldiers and getting an understanding where they came from. And defence and the Army is fantastic in that it draws people from all walks of life, from all parts of Australia. And so you really get to have those conversations, particularly when you're out bush on exercise or on operations, at a casual level, but at a deeper level, probably than any boss would ever experience in the real world in a commercial context. So I really enjoyed that, and it certainly makes you aware of, I guess, the calibre of the Australian soldier as well, and the types of people that we bring in, and how it really forms us. Whether you're an officer or a soldier, it can really forge you in a much stronger way after having served.
Yeah, and you would have learnt a lot about yourself, obviously, leading and how you led. You can do a lot of self-reflection and understand some key lessons there. But you and your own leadership style and even how you lead life now would have been shaped by a leader of some type at somewhere, whether it was in the private sector or in the Army. Do you have some, you don't have to name them, but can you remember, are there some key people that were pivotal to your personal development and shaped how you lead?
Yeah, certainly. One of the things you very quickly realise once you've served in defence is how unoriginal you are when you see other people with very similar characteristics and mannerisms and ways of working to you. So I'll say that at the outset. The other thing I would say is I probably learned some lessons of good leaders, and equally I learnt some lessons of not so good leaders. And one of the things I always say when talking about leadership, it's a bit like having a healthy diet. Most people, when they're in a leadership position, have a good understanding of what the right things are they should be doing. Leadership is not a destination. It's like a diet. You've got to continually work at it and remind yourself of doing the right things. So that was one of the key things that I learned. And after a while, you give yourself permission to understand when you've been a bit slack and that what you need to do to fix your leadership style. So there'll definitely be people that are listening to this podcast that will go, I remember when, and my apologies for that. No one's perfect as a leader, but I certainly think a couple of key things that I learnt, particularly in the private sector actually, one that I really took away from this was trust early. So I had an executive manager that I worked with at the Suncorp Group, and I was a management consultant at the time. And I came in to work on a major project for him. And it was within a couple of days, he almost had that conversation saying, Ben, I trust you. You're an expert at delivery. You've got this. Advise me on what we do and let's get after this. And what I found about that is it gave me the permission to stop trying to put on a show and actually focus on doing the doing. And it really stuck with me and allowed me to shift my performance much more quickly and get focused on that task than it otherwise would have. So that's certainly a lesson that I try and bring.
You mean because you didn't need to continuously prove why you should be trusted?
Exactly.
You already had it up front, so then
Yep.
you could focus on the delivery?
So most of us will try and I get it. There is that kind of risk management approach where you try and make your people earn trust.
The whole way along.
And so what he did is he gave trust until you proved otherwise that you shouldn't be trusted.
I like that, yeah.
I certainly try and adopt that both in private sector but also the military perspective. And particularly from a military perspective, you've had people that have gone through iterations of training experience, and there has to be that degree of trust. Of course, you check prudently as a result as well, and you rely on others to do that checking too. But if you give that trust early, you can get so much more results from your people.
Interesting, I like it. Recently, we were Beaton Zone Venture Partners was announced as Australia's most controversial venture fund, and you were the first person to share it and then also write something about it. So I'm interested to find out, first of all, why are you okay with putting your name to something that seems to be controversial for a nation?
Well, for a start, it shouldn't be controversial. I almost wear it as a badge of honour, and I'm really proud of what the team at Beaton Zone are doing, and particularly about that advocacy to make sure that Australians understand, well, not just Australians, that the West understands that it is very important for us to be able to fight and forge for the free. And Beaton Zone is playing a part in that. And that if we're not investing in our national defence and security, then it'll be very, very hard for us to match the potential adversaries. And there's certainly, in this age of competition, there is a number of nation states that put in huge amounts of effort and investment in their own defence and national security. And as they say, weakness is provocative. We've got to look at the world actually as it actually is and make prudent investments to ensure that we are capable and, should the worst occur, able to respond. So I'm really proud that Beaton Zone in particular is making an effort to ensure that private capital and indeed public capital and entrepreneurs have an understanding that this is an area that we do need to invest in. We need to build that defensive capability in this nation again.
Yeah, and most of your content reflects that sentiment. You're usually calling out where the gaps are, who's doing what we're not doing, or sharing a pattern from a previous era that is going to be, or your prediction almost that it was going to repeat itself. Who do you hope's listening?
Well,
when you're writing this,
who
do you hope is going to be reading what you've written and have that message land for them?
Yeah, look, I think it's a couple of different audiences, and I think it's really important to have the contest of ideas, because if we just leave the status quo, then there's only one set of ideas. We don't know the gaps, we don't know the blind spots, and I think we settle for second best. And if we have a look through Australia's history, Australia has a really bad track record of waiting a little bit too long before we respond. And the good example of this is 1938. So 1938, where literally the war drums are beating in Germany. The war drums are beating, I think Japan had already invaded Korea, had already invaded China, and Australia had 1.5% of GDP invested in defence, less than 12 months before World War II started. So I really hope that we've got people in uniform listening. I hope we've got people in defence industry and wider industry listening, because we can come back to that. We will need the wider industry companies that aren't doing anything with defence at the moment. That's where we actually need to build a lot of dual use capability as well. And I think that probably the last area is politicians and thought leaders. There's a lot of politicians in Australia at the moment who are idealistic, and I can understand that. They're looking at the world and hoping it will be a certain way. And I think we need a lot more optimistic realism, seeing as the world as it is, and then looking at what we can do to either mitigate risk or take up the opportunities that are there as a nation.
So even if they don't listen or they move too slowly, you can always count on entrepreneurs to get things done faster without usually the various blocks along the way. Of course, selling back into the ADF is always the challenge. But if you have good capability, amazing solutions, viable ideas out there, what would you suggest? And how do you suggest for some people who are working on tech right now, they're not from the defence sector though.
Yeah.
So we know the challenges with either communicating, plugging into, selling to, having things tested to the right technical level.
Yep.
And being ready. What advice would you give to those founders who you know are working on solutions that could absolutely be utilised? Mm-hmm. What should they be doing right now?
I think firstly, you've got to be able to tell your story, because you're going to have to be able to explain your value proposition to both people in uniform, but also to our political class as well. And I think the more that you're able to tell that story and advocate for your positions and what
by story,
you're
do you
pushing.
mean, so here's my solution, this is what it does?
Yes, very much so. And explain the benefits of that particular solution. There's some key things I think that defence, if it's not looking for now, will need to look for in the future. And I think scale is certainly one of them. So solutions that are able to be scaled. So one of the things I would say is, particularly in the last couple of decades, the defence industry has become very good at making artisan assembly line approaches, high-end, exquisite technology that is expensive and very, very laborious and takes a lot of time to make it.
Ryan said the exact same words not
Yep.
half an hour ago. He said
Yep.
exactly what you just said.
And so what we
We're
need
good
to...
at that, not the other. So what else? What else can we focus on? And like you said, the storytelling, and then maybe you can jump in, Jake, to share how do we get the average person with their amazing tech, not average, but really smart tech founder, right?
Yeah.
Or hungry founder with a great technical capability. What are the steps to get into defence to prove and tell that story? Because this is usually the challenge of who do you speak to, how long is it going to take, and how do they prove the capability with all of those deep levels of testing that are required?
It isn't a new challenge. I think probably Otis as a front door is a great example. Office of Defence Industry Support, if I remember the acronym correctly. So they have a presence throughout Australia, and they're certainly a good front door, so you start getting some familiarisation with how defence works and how to work with the defence procurement process, which isn't easy. That's certainly one path. But probably the other thing I would say too is don't just limit yourself to defence customer. And in fact, I think that's, if you have a solution that is dual use, ideally you build your customer base out on the commercial side or in other areas or internationally.
Prove the capability, do all the
100%.
testing. Yep.
And
Product in market
yes.
is easier to sell than one that hasn't been deployed yet.
For sure. And I know Steve will quite often say, Steve Baxter will often encourage people to not make the Australian Defence Force their primary customer, get a customer base elsewhere and look at the Australian Defence Force as your cream.
Yes.
And I think that is a really prudent advice, because the Australian Defence Force at the moment is still in a very small scale. We're still only spending 2% of GDP. The force in being and the way we're working at the moment is not what the force in the fight would look like. And it's not the way that we would work in combat. And, throwing back to one of my heroes in Essington Lewis, who was the managing director of BHP during World War II, he got tapped on the shoulder by Menzies as Prime Minister to come across and run the Department of Munitions. When he did this, Menzies gave him, I'll use the term blank check, but he excluded him from a lot of the same rules and standards that they were applying to public servants, because this was World War II and we needed to get things done fast. And there's some great examples, and I would encourage people to look back at Essington Lewis's history about how he got things done super quickly. They built an explosives factory in Salisbury that had thousands of people working at it, hundreds of buildings within 12 months. mean, we can barely get a house built now in 12 months.
But if
in an
we
entire
had, if
explosives
we
factory.
could deploy some of that thinking and capability in today's day and age, what could we achieve in 6 months?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see, and we will most definitely need to have that sort of thinking if the worst occurs.
And on that same vein, in the last couple of questions, and you've sort of answered already, from an industry perspective, and I know mobilisation's a massive passion area of yours and you're very knowledgeable in the area of mobilisation. I'll ask a simple question and you can say as much or as little as you want. Do you think the Australian Defence Industrial Base is ready for large-scale combat operations in a say, a near-peer war?
No, definitely not. And I think the first thing we need to look at when we talk about our industrial base is quite often we talk about the defence industrial base. And when you look at history and when you look overseas, what's very evident is that when the nation mobilises, it needs to mobilise far beyond what you would call defence industry. It's a very small proportion of industry as a whole. We'll need to tap into companies and entities that are not working with defence at the moment. You'll need to tap into logistics experts. It might be Woolworths where you get your best logistics experts from. You might need to tap into BHP again. So there's companies that are not doing work with defence at the moment that would certainly have some expertise that you would need to leverage. So I think if you were looking at one of the ways that you could make the Australian Defence Force and Australia a lot more resilient from a mobilisation perspective, it's not just the force in being we need to focus at. We need to also think about the industrial base. And it may be that you look at war stocks differently. And one of the things that I've found when spending more time in industry and thinking more about industry is that some of those war stocks might need to be things like machine tools. There might be a simple machine tool and a great example is getting used for barrel forging for our 155mm howitzers. Now, once they fire a certain amount of rounds, they need to replace that barrel. Now, there's only one or two manufacturers of the specialty tools that are needed for a forge to make those barrels. And if you wait until the war drums start to beat, you're getting in a very long queue for some artisan factory in Austria that makes a machine tool, and you're having to depend on that company prioritising your needs as a nation. So what we do need to think about a lot more are what are those consumables of combat that we need onshore, either as a stockpile, or what are those consumables of combat that we want to manufacture onshore. And it might not be that you want to set up the assembly line straight away, but you're going to at least need the specialty tools, the machine tools, onshore, ready to access and set up if you need to. So there's some huge opportunities in that space. And I think government can play a really key role in identifying a couple of these areas and plugging that gap, because if we have a look around the world, there's not a single nation, even the United States, the home of the free market, that doesn't have a sizable government involvement in its industrial base and its defence industrial base. I think the Australian government can certainly make some prudent investments to build resilience by doing similar.
Everything that you said there, a lot of people say is being alarmist and that's not going to happen and we're not in the era of war anymore. What do you say to that when you're faced with, do you get those types of, do you get that feedback? Do you have people come at you with some comments along the lines of that? Yeah,
there's certainly, and I can understand it. There are a lot of idealists, there are a lot of optimists that are looking at the world as they wish it to be. And my advice would be, we just need to look at the world a little bit more clear-eyed. And I would approach this in a very similar way to we do personally with insurance. We all have home insurance, we all have motor insurance for a reason. Now, if the risk to your home or location was increasing, well, apart from your premium increasing, you would also be taking other measures to ensure that you are protected against should the worst occur. And what I would say is if you have a look around now, and you don't need to take it from me, you can take it from both sides of politics, read the Defence Strategic Review, have a look at other nations' assessments of how things are at, and I would respectfully say that the geopolitical circumstances in the Indo-Pacific are a lot more contentious than they've been for a very, very long period of time. And if we even consider back to the Cold War era, so during the Cold War era, there was an average defence spending of about 3% of GDP. We're currently at 2%. Now, a lot of people are saying that what we're seeing now in our own region, but also there's a land war in Ukraine that's 3 years in. There's a long list of things I can start going through that are occurring in the Middle East and other areas. There is certainly a lot more risk around. And so I think we need to have a look at what is that right investment in our defence and national security to make sure we both deter in our region. We're presenting a strong face, but also be ready should the worst occur to respond as needed.
If you had the opportunity, like the BHP employee from World War II, I think it was, and you had a blank cheque given to you, but it wasn't for you to spend, it was given to you to invest into founders with technology, what would you be choosing right now?
There's a few different things I think would be really good to have onshore. And at the moment, what I see Australia doing a lot of, getting in queue for American solutions that are great, but are going to be really, really hotly contested should something occur. And so what I would like to see a lot more is some sovereign solutions, either where we've got licensed IP and a manufacturing onshore, or ideally we're seeing small to medium enterprises and entrepreneurs starting to create novel solutions onshore. And some of the things, particularly around missiles, both to attack and defend, be great to have a lot more manufacturing capability onshore. And of course, there's some dual use purpose there for space, which is a really exciting area from a commercial perspective, not just a defence perspective. So I think the missile area would be a great way to see both for integrated air and missile defence, but also long-range strike, that we need that capability. The other reason I think there's some real opportunities in missiles is that we're not going to be able to scale our surface fleet, for instance, to the same degree as others. But it's a really good deterrence factor to have some really capable anti-shipping missiles as a sovereign capability to offset that as an example. I think there's some really interesting autonomous solutions that we're starting to see as well. And I think what we will see is the emergence of a lot more crewed and uncrewed teaming. We're starting to think about this, but we're not there quite yet. But a good example is you might see a fighter jet, for instance, that's paired with a couple of uncrewed craft as well that are either there to support it kinetically through something can strike or non-kinetically protecting that airframe or even indeed refueling that airframe. So I think there is some solutions there from an autonomous perspective or an uncrewed perspective that Australia could be developing onshore a lot more as well. And that offset capability, I think, is a key one that we need to think about. We're not going to be able to build a joint strike fighter onshore, but you have a look at what Boeing's doing with the Ghost Bat as an example, as something we can do onshore that provides some of the capabilities that a crewed platform would and enables us to leverage more the capability of the exquisite solutions we currently have in service, either to protect them or to expand their range. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities there. The other thing I would say is that we can't forget about being brilliant at the basics. So there are some things that will never go out of fashion when it comes to combat. You're going to still need even the basics like boots, uniforms, soldier combat ensemble, although it'll be interesting to see what that would look like in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously having the more high tech, obviously, is going to be the next innovation of that. Is that correct?
Well, it could be, but the other thing to consider is how does that scale? So I think when I was talking before about the Middle East area of operations mindset, we need to think about what the force and the combat might look like. And so we may be coming up with a high-tech solution, but can that high-tech solution be scaled times 10, times 100, times 1,000, times 10,000, times 100,000? And if we think back to World War II, where we had, I think it was just over 1 million people in uniform, as an example, things get really, really big. I thought I saw war at scale when I was in Iraq, and I was in an area in Iraq where there was a coalition base with about 30,000 people on it. But then to think about the types of scale we would see in a large-scale combat operation, like you're seeing in Ukraine right now, is another level. So I think a lot of these solutions you need to be able to manufacture at mass as well for it to be feasible.
So what are we doing well?
I think we do a lot of things really well.
There's a lot of gaps we're talking about, but are we doing anything well right now?
Yeah, I think we're doing a lot of things well. So we are a boutique defence force that is very highly trained, has some highly exquisite systems that are really well set up for the types of wars we fought previously. I think we've got a really good backbone to build from in terms of that foundation from training and equipment. And certainly the Australian Defence Force has a really good ability to work with international partners, particularly our Americans, but also Pacific Islands, New Zealand, etc. as well. So we've got some really good coalitions and ways of working together that will be really useful to build. And when I look back at history, one of the things that does give me a lot of optimism is that Australia, while we take a while to respond, once we do, we scale up and work very effectively. And World War II, also during the era of Korea, but indeed also in the era of Vietnam, through national service, mind you, we were able to scale our defence forces and make a really key contribution to those particular conflicts or peacekeeping operations as well. So I'm confident we've got a really good base. What I would like to see is that we're getting ourselves on the front foot, both from a defence perspective, but of course also an industry perspective, to be ready to scale up and respond for that force in the fight should the worst occur.
This has been a very insightful conversation. Just Ben, I guess one last question to close it out. What would you say is the personal cost of a life of service, and what did you found Reservist, the Veterans Advocacy Group?
Yeah, so when I was at the Suncorp Group, it probably would have been about 5 years in. The CEO at the time, not the current CEO, a previous one, sent out an email just before Anzac Day, and it would have been written by his communications team, but it was a bit lackluster in terms of its recognition of the significance of Anzac Day. And I kind of sat back and went, oh, geez, that's not really good enough. And then I had to think about, well, who should be advising Suncorp on how to do it better? And I immediately kind of got the guilt and said, I've been here for 5 years. What have I been doing about this? And so I and a group of other veterans at Suncorp founded Service ERG, which stood for Employee Resource Group. And it was at first focused on supporting veterans and their families, but almost immediately we also realised that there was a lot of commonalities between emergency services. And so we formed a support group for defence families and emergency services. And it was a really good way to give back, but also build Suncorp's understanding about veterans and emergency services and their families and the unique issues and challenges, but also benefits they bring to an employer. And so one of the things I would say to anyone listening to this podcast, if you're in a company, is have a look at what they already have for a veteran support group. And if not, if you don't have one, create one. It was an excellent opportunity to introduce people that hadn't necessarily had contact with defence to the veterans community. Suncorp was excellent with that, actually, and most employers are. Once they have an understanding of defence, the opportunities. I think
sometimes they need to be shown. They need They need to have somebody from a different perspective, like you did, and highlight what is possible, rather than sitting back and criticising, like you said, the lacklustre announcement or response. Is actually highlight what is going to be impactful and how you could connect with veterans or their families, maybe.
And there's some really good government programs for that straight away. The Prime Minister's Veterans Employment Awards that are still going, run out of the Department of Veteran Affairs, is an excellent program to get involved with as an employer or an employee. From the reserves perspective, Defence Reserve Support is actually a really good program, again, to get involved with if you're a reservist or you're an employer of a reservist. And both of those programs also have recognition awards as well. So it's a really good way to recognise good employers and what employers are doing. And they're both quite high profile. And we actually nominated, whilst at Suncorp, one of my co-chair at the time, Devor Strabak, who had this awesome story about coming from being a refugee, migrating to Australia and then serving in the Australian Army. And we nominated him for the Prime Minister's Veterans Employee Award and he won it. So it was a great recognition. Veterans got a really high profile in Suncorp as a result. So I'd certainly encourage people to look at creating something similar for your own organisation if you haven't already.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, excellent conversation. It went in all different directions, which is the best way to have them.
Definitely.
So thank you so much, Ben, for your time. Jake and I really appreciate it. And Beaten Zone is forever grateful for the amount and depth of research and the content that you get to provide with us. And also just having you on the broader team is always good.
Yeah.
So thanks for the conversation today and for everything else that you do for us.
No, awesome. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for joining us in the briefing room. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with the people shaping our national security and future capability. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show, share it with a friend, and join us next time for more stories and insights from the front lines of innovation. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep building the future.